Yeah, thank you. Good morning, everyone. My name, as Sophia has said, is Franklin. I teach theories of development and cities in the Global South at Global Development Studies here at the University of Helsinki. On behalf of the other organizers of this session, notably Dr. Özlem Çelik, but also Sophia and Sana, I'd like to welcome you again to this morning's talk. Our world is awash with oil. Indeed, for some, much of the history of the world is a history of fossil, a family of resources, the most powerful of which is perhaps oil. Yet, every aspect of this resource is characterized by controversy. Its extraction, export, processing, distribution, storage, sale, purchase, and use. The political, economic, social, and geopolitical implications of the ownership and control of oil turn the world upside down. Perhaps the most challenging of all these are the socio-ecological ramifications of a world centered on oil extractivisms. These concerns are echoed and indeed magnified in the context of Africa and the Middle East, where oil extraction has had a long and visible presence. In spite of the global downturn in the oil market, due partly to the current pandemic, partly to increasing social cost of extraction, and particularly to strong and sustained campaigns against oil, reflecting global concerns for a climate emergency, the study of oil is fundamentally deadlocked between the conventional wisdom that advocates more oil and the Western left consensus that passionately rejects that pathway. This dichotomy can be found in most of the existing theories and analytical frameworks for the study of oil. Among others, these are resource scarce doctrine, the paradox of plenty, the enclave thesis, anomy, factor endowment hypothesis, and the open access exploitation thesis. None of these analytical frameworks and with them normative stances takes into account oil cities in general and oil cities in Africa in particular. Of course, this raises the question about whether oil cities are special and hence require more careful, granular analysis, rather than the broad brush, grandstanding, grand theorizing, grand one-size-fits-all normative positions that characterize the conventional wisdom and the Western left consensus. In this session, we answer the question in the affirmative, among others, because of three interrelated reasons. First, oil cities are melting pots, simultaneously open and closed spaces of racial, ethnic, class, and gender tensions and contradictions. They are also spaces for migrants of these and other identities involved in diverse forms of work, ranging from contract and flexible workers to so-called permanent workers, fly-in and fly-out workers. So the study of oil cities offers unique analytical, but also policy and practice opportunities. Among them, to examine the unequal ownership and control of land and capital, to investigate complex property rights structures that characterize gated housing communities in company towns or developed elsewhere as a result of oil-based urbanism, to offer a penetrating analysis of the state and the extensive power of transnational corporations, which tend to act as the new local, indeed national state and labor aristocracy that comes with hiring experts of different races and classes. To probe the expulsion of urban farmers, urban fishers, to investigate soil degradation, the loss of biodiversity, and the disruption of urban food systems as a result of the extractivisms around oil. To spotlight emissions, among others, from transport and construction, gentrification, sprawl, waste, including plastic and electronic, and petroleum accidents in general. to analyze political economic tensions and contradictions in society, economy, environment transformations, and the place of institutions and diverse urban movements in these processes. On the global scale, oil cities provide the opportunity to analyze the low-end place of such cities in the global process of value creation and a distribution question such as the socio-ecological contribution of such cities and yet the private appropriation of such value. Indeed, apart from becoming clusters of urban and regional inequality within nation states or Africa more broadly, the unequal position of oil cities in relation to the oil capitals of the world justify focusing on them. Second, a key and crucial part of the case to study oil cities is addressing the rent question. The study of land rent is important for all urban analysis, but for oil cities, rent is even more important, because not only do we talk about land rent in the built environment, but also resource rent in the so-called natural environment. Indeed, not only is the question about the built environment or the natural environment, but also their dialectical relationships across space and time. This spatio-temporal political economy gives a different meaning to the idea of absentee ownership, which in oil cities takes on quite complex forms. Few powerful groups could control large cities and territories, cutting through land, water, forest, farms, biodiversity, from global centers of power and domination, after which new centers of concentration in the global south are patterned. Third, studying oil cities provides one of the most compelling ways to address the continuing problem of spatial separatism. In his book, Regions in Question, first published in the 1980s, but republished recently as a classic, British economic geographer Charles Gore points out a disturbing problem in development studies, in which one scale of analysis is emphasized to the neglect of others, although we all live in one earth. Because of all these reasons, showing the tensions and contradictions between society, environment, and economy, the study of oil cities can teach us that, in contrast to the normative advocacy for simple one-size-fits-all universal positions that characterize the claims of the conventional wisdom and the Western left consensus, the question is not at all about just change or just about climate change, but a just change, just transition, and a just transformation in social, political, economic, and ecological relations across all scales in the world. This calls for new and renewed emphasis on limits to inequalities, not just limits to growth. This sort of theoretically and empirically granular and careful analysis could help to decolonize both existing conventional wisdom and existing Western left consensus, idealist and utopian alternatives which profess revolution without a historically grounded plan or without paying attention to historically colonizing institutions, vested interests, local and global power structures and politics. Ali Almoghazy, a doctoral scholar at the University of Helsinki, connecting from Egypt in Africa, is the one to help us navigate oil cities using a case study of oil cities in Egypt. In his classic book on Egyptian society, entitled The African Origin of Civilization, Myth or Reality, Sheikh Anta Diop dismisses the left-right dichotomy as particularly inapplicable to Egypt and the rest of Africa. Dr. Diop argued that compelling and liberating analysis of Africa should neither be left nor right. It must simply be original. The so-called Arab Spring, which many Africanists, notably Adam Branch and Zakaria Mampeli, have argued should properly be called African Spring, shows clearly that Sheikh Anta Diop's position has enduring relevance, because The uprising did not follow the secular and Western revolutionary theories of the left, which have very little to say about the political economy of religions and African spirituality in Africa and the Middle East. Insights that can be obtained from studying the work of Malcolm X in Egypt, for example. That position is similarly taken by Black feminists such as Bell Hooks in Teaching to Transgress and Stella Dazi in A Kick in the Belly. Other Black and African scholars have taken the same position. I note C.L.R. James's book, Black Jacobins, C.J. Robinson's book, Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition, Niger Marxism's Revolutionary Thought in Nigeria by Adam Meyer, the classical book, The Shared Space, The Two Circuits of the Urban Economy in Underdeveloped Countries by the Afro-Brazilian scholar Milton Santos, widely regarded as the father of critical geography in Brazil, and the book by Julian Ajiman on just sustainabilities. There is no better person to be the discussant for Ali Almoghazy's paper or talk today than Dr. Joe Collins, connecting from Sydney, Australia. Dr. Collins is based at the Department of Political Economy, University of Sydney, where he teaches political economy of development. A specialist in the rank theory of the Nigerian Marxist Chibozu Nwoke and a student of Southern theory, Joe's research is currently focused around questions of rank theory, landed property, and extractivisms. His PhD thesis proposed a historically contingent theory of landed property in Australia as a point of departure for constructing a socially significant theory of mineral rent. His forthcoming book is on resource rent theory generally, with implications for value theory, urban and regional political economy, and the history of economic thought. The rest of this seminar should take about 1 hour 45 minutes, divided as follows. Ali will present his work within 30 to 40 minutes, followed by 20 to 30 minutes dialogue between Joe and Ali. Then there's going to be a general discussion, which should take about 30 to 40 minutes, and in the form of questions and comments placed in the chat box. We'll finish off with information about the next session. So, Ali, you now have the floor.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Franklin, and good morning, everyone from Egypt. I would like to thank you all for being here, and without further ado, let's start with our presentation. So, Sophia, if you can share the screen. So basically, the research I'm about to present to you today is going to be included in my doctoral research dissertation under the Political, Societal, and Regional Change Program in the University of Helsinki. Next, please. The research is going to discuss the challenges faced by African oil cities regarding uneven development, and more recently challenges regarding climate change and shocks to the global market, like pandemics pertaining to situations like COVID-19 that we are all going through now. My presentation is going to be divided as follows. I'm going to give you an introduction about the subject, about oil cities and their development globally, and then we're going to focus more on oil cities in the global south. Then we will touch upon the interconnections between oil rents, state or government control, and the cities where oil extractivism are based. Then we will move on to discuss the potential impacts of climate change and its relations with oil extraction, and how the current paradigms, current policies pertaining to adaptation and mitigation to climate change and decarbonization are going to influence the structure and format of the oil industry, and how this is going to be projected into onto oil cities. Next slide, please. Then I'm going to share with you the research plan and methodology of my research. And we are going to then to talk about the hypotheses and research questions that are going to be raised in the research. And finally, we'll have some concluding remarks, and I'm going to share my references with you. Next, please. In order to sit you in nicely with the problems faced by oil cities, particularly in Africa, in Global South, and Egypt, this is a problem that these cities are facing now, with the growing concern about climate change and growing number of extreme weather events that we are going to that we are hearing about and facing in different parts of the world. In late October 2016, the city of Ras Gharib, which is located on the western coast of the Red Sea, western coast of the Red Sea in Egypt, faced an extreme rain event where an estimated volume of 120 million cubic meters fell in one night in late October, and on the nearby Red Sea mountains, and a torrential flood came rushing down from the mountains and into the city, causing destruction of loss in life and destruction of property. From field research on the if you can go back, please. From field research on the ground and desktop research, I found that such events used to happen in the past, but with much less intensity and with much less frequency. Research into changing climate patterns due to climate change indicate that the frequency and intensity of such events are going to increase. So we are going to face climate-related disasters inflicting damage into cities that are going to simply increase. Having said that, this particular situation puts oil cities in some sort of a conundrum, because basically the oil industry is one of the main culprits behind climate change, having a direct and indirect having a direct and indirect part in causing climate change, are coming up to almost to more than 25% of the greenhouse gas emissions. So under the current regimes governing response to climate change, like for instance the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015, with the reduction of promulgated reduction of usage and dependence on oil and other fossil fuels, these cities are faced with a situation where they are going to have to cut back on their basically livelihood. So if we carry on with the business as usual scenario, with as Dr. Obeng-Odoom has just said, with the conventional wisdom, people are going to extract oil like they have always done. This will also cause climate change with its adverse effects, like what we have seen in Ras Gharib. But if we cut back on oil extraction, this will cause less jobs and possibly economic demise of such cities. So that's the problem, that's the predicament of oil cities. And we are going to explore it further in the following slides. Next slide, please. This project aims at first at a number of things. The first thing is to create a better understanding of the oil city for a phenomenon with the intersection between extractive industrial, and a better understanding of extractive industry related urbanization. And we have to, as Dr. Obeng-Odoom has said in his introduction, that we have to focus more on the oil cities in the global south, because they have some sort of colonial inheritance, and the structure of the industrial governance of the oil industry is somewhat more globally oriented than local, which has its implications on the industrial development and, of course, the urban governance and development. The challenges, as I've just mentioned, facing oil cities are like climate change and decarbonization, sustainable consumption, and competition by renewables. Next slide, please. The final aim for this project is to create some sort of a sustainable scenario for oil cities, which is more compliant with climate change and the doctrines governing adaptation, mitigation measures, and decarbonization, all this stuff. And at the same time, try to break try to dismantle the current, or to propose dismantling of the current structure of the global oil industry, because obviously had caused that it has separated the production of oil and on one part the production of oil and the social and environmental ramifications of this process. It has separated these processes from the wealth generated through the different machinations of the oil industry and from oil extraction to further downstream activity. So one of the main culprits behind the conundrum which oil cities find themselves in at the moment is the existing structure of the global oil industry. So this has to be tackled. Next slide, please. Then we are going to discuss. The research is going to discuss the oil city as a phenomenon. Humanity has known urban centers based on resource extraction for millennia. We have in different places around the world and in different areas across the human history, we have witnessed mining towns based around mines, quarries, and so on. It has been present in Europe, in Asia, in Africa, and in the Americas. But what gained some sort of notoriety basically is, or what has been more ingrained into the popular culture, are those related to precious metals like silver and gold on one side, and those related to energy resources like primarily coal and oil. The thing is that about energy resources, precious metals like gold and silver, is that gold and silver in themselves, they can be used as reservoir of value, while in energy resources they are mostly used in downstream activities and in further products in further processes of production. So in the case of, for instance, the California gold rush that happened in the mid-19th century, mining towns depending on gold would turn into ghost towns once the gold mines are depleted. While in the case of energy mining towns, like those built around coal or petroleum, they differ in the fact that other industries can be located within these cities, creating some sort of an agglomeration economy and forward and backward linkages that would cause potentially the diversification of the local economy, the creation of jobs, and retention of population for retention of a diverse population. Within energy resource towns or energy resource mining towns, coal and petroleum would differ is that due to the coal is less transportable than petroleum or natural gas, so the downstream activities tend to be located close by, creating the potential of having heavier industries like coal, like steel industry, in the vicinity of those mining towns. And that would in turn cause further, enable the opportunity for having further forward linkages where other industries can be based in the same vicinity. While in the case of petroleum can be more easily transportable, so downstream activities can be more remotely located, and hence this gives the rise to the fact that the petroleum market can be more globally oriented, and that makes it harder for oil cities to capture the full benefit of the resource extraction. In case of natural gas can natural gas is much more complex to transport, but it can be viewed in the same way that petroleum is viewed. So next slide, please. Historically speaking, the first oil city can be traced back to North America around the middle of the 19th century. We have oil city in Pennsylvania, USA, which was the site of one of the first commercial oil extraction activities. In the following decade, following the first after the first struck oil, the city became. If you can see the background of this slide, this is an image of derricks in oil cities around 1860, where the landscape around the city was basically follows these structures. But after 10 to 15 years, after oil was extracted, these structures were dismantled and the city basically lost its purpose. And now Oil City in Pennsylvania is a small town. It's not the boom town that it used to be 150 years ago. And the same thing happens in other parts of the world, like Petrolia in Canada. While it differs in other locations, like Houston in the United States as well, where petroleum industry arrived at a more robust incubator, because basically Houston was, or by the time of petroleum activity, it was already an established commercial and transport hub. So when the oil industry started to grow in the city, the revenues or the revenues of the industry started to be invested in other activities serving or catering to the needs of the petroleum industry. Another thing is that, particularly in the United States, and it's very prominent in the case of Houston, is the dominance of private initiative. Private initiative here indicates that it indicates the notion of finders keepers. If petroleum is found under under a plot of land owned by a certain person, he has the right to the ordinance for this. People have to pay him in order to access this oil. So that initiated a wave of land grabbing, where oil investors, oil developers from all over the United States starting pouring into Houston, particularly after the discovery of oil in Spindletop, the famous. I don't know if you know this, but that's where the famous gusher image of petroleum industry, where petroleum oil, crude oil, start pouring out of the ground. Or they said that it carried on pouring for around 9 days without assistance, without pressurized resistance. So this image, this iconic image, changed the relation where between oil extraction and cities, because basically cities such as Houston started to be more of focal points to the oil industry, and due to, as I said, to the nature of the local economy in Houston, it stabilized, and unlike oil city and unlike oil city in Pennsylvania, it started giving way to other economic activity that helped stabilize the population, retain the population, and create more economic diversity. The next slide, please. I think you missed the slide. So I wouldn't speak much about oil rents in the presence of experts on the subject like Dr. Obeng-Odoom and Dr. Collins, but to touch slightly upon the issue, very basically, oil rent is something that you have to pay in order to access the oil present somewhere. So and you pay it to the to the entity controlling this piece of land. In some parts of the world, oil rents were used in order to finance development in areas where mineral resources in parts of the world where mineral resources are controlled by the central state other than by individual entities. For instance, in the Persian Gulf countries, and in other parts like Venezuela and Libya and so on. In that case, the role of governance structure is very important because and this is something that we are going to attest to examine in this research work, whether in case of dominance of the private sector and private initiative, that oil rents gets more likely to circulate within the local economy, causing the enhancement or the more diversification of the economy of the oil cities themselves. While in case of government control, particularly central government control, oil rents are collected centrally, and they are and the expenditure or disposing of these sums of money are centrally directed and they are more removed from where the process of extraction is done, and hence they are more liable to corruption, to cause corruption in the upper echelons of the government. They are more or less removed from uh, uh, public oversight. Yeah, next. Now we are going to talk about the impacts of climate change on the oil industry. Uh, as I mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, one of the problems facing the petroleum industry or the oil industry is that the industry itself causes around 9% of the global greenhouse gas emissions due to processes related to oil extraction, transportation, and so on. And then the fuels, which comes at further downstream activities, the fuels made through further downstream activities of the oil industry power our machines, our factories, and our whole consumption model, and that amount to around 33% of of the global greenhouse gas emissions. And climate change response regimes like the Paris Climate Agreement of 2015 stipulated that we move away, or basically phase out our dependence on fossil fuels. So the oil industry is going to take what people may say as a direct hit during to these policies, which will may cause downsizing, layoffs, and leaving the industry more susceptible to fluctuations in the oil prices and demand shocks like what happened in during the current pandemic. And this in turn will have its impact on oil cities, because basically if the industry is the main industrial activity, and for instance, like in the case of Ras Gharib, where the oil industry is the only, it's almost the only industry available in the city, this will have an impact on the city. The city will become less attractive, the provision of service will be harder, and so on. And these cities are likely to lose its population and lose its place in the local, regional, and the national economy. Now one of the things that another of the particular challenges pertaining to climate change when it comes to the oil industry is the issue of decarbonization. To the extent that, and this is going in a number of directions. First, that we have from the oil industry, or and to keep the oil in the ground to prolong, or as borrowing the term of the global response to the current COVID pandemic, that we have to flatten the curve of oil consumption and thus oil-related pollution, and to keep it in the ground for the future generations to figure out a way to use it with less pollution. Next slide, please. This leads, as I said, to a drop in revenues, expected revenues by the oil industry, and it will force the oil companies, especially large international corporations, to figure out a way to survive. Among the mechanisms that such companies have started to act upon is a diversification of production portfolios, and in some cases that these companies are trying to reconfigure themselves as not to be seen as oil companies, but rather as energy companies. We have, for instance, the British Petroleum has started investing in renewables by acquiring one of the companies making, I think, wind turbines. So they are basically diversifying into renewables. But the thing is that what is really important is that due to what I've earlier mentioned, is that due to the global structure of the oil industry, that the accumulation of wealth or the accumulation of capital generated from the oil industry is generally, particularly in the cases of oil industry, oil cities in Africa, the wealth is accumulated in one place, while the production and the adverse and all the effects, being it adverse or otherwise, social and environmental adverse effects are located in another. They are basically separated. So we have to make sure that with the advent of climate change mitigation, adaptation policies and regimes, that these companies, the transnational corporations that have basically inherited the structure of the global oil industry from the colonial era, that turned these oil fields into some sort of colonial outposts. We have to make sure that these TNCs, transnational corporations, don't run away from the responsibilities toward the population of such cities. We have to make sure that the new models of production, owing to the diversification of production portfolios, benefit those populations and have less adverse effects on them and on their surrounding environment. We have to hold these companies accountable, because basically they have been accumulating wealth on the expense of these people for quite a long time. So it is time for them to give back, or to carry the burden. They carry the burden of change, or at least share it with the local population and government. Next slide, please. So I'm going to briefly touch upon the research plan and methodologies I'm going to adhere to, or try to adhere to, in this research. So the research and the subsequent and resultant dissertation is going to be divided into 3 main chapters. The first chapter concerns the concepts and theories that I'm going to deal with in this research. Then we're going to analyze the existing scenarios, particularly in the oil cities in Africa, as a representation of the global South. And then finally, we'll try to extract lessons from these scenarios in order to apply it in the case study of Urbanity. Next slide, please. We're going to discuss the concepts and theories revolving around industrial urbanization and theories of industrial location theory for cities. We are going to reflect on the northern versus southern paradigms of development, with particular interest in global stratification and uneven development, and the relation of extractivism and the oil industry, and its responses to global crises like global pandemic and causing disruption in production and climate change. Next slide, please. Then we are going to analyze the scenarios of oil cities by trying to evaluate the links between industrial and urban development, and try to map the locations of these cities briefly, so that we have a better idea of the contribution of these cities to the development of the respective countries, and to measure the weight in their national economy. Then we are going to zoom in into the global south. With the collection of the general characteristics of OECD development in the global south, the link to the colonial era, and the transition from the colonial era to the current system of transnational corporations and their relations to both the local and the central government. Next slide, please. Now and then we are going to analyze a number of African oil cities. We're going to discuss the origins, their weight and place in the national oil industry, and the role of the oil industry in creating their part in the GDP, in their country's GDP. These cities will be Port Harcourt in Nigeria, Luanda in Angola, Algeria, Tripoli in Libya, and North Gharib in Egypt. And these are the top 5 producing countries, oil producing countries in Africa. And all of them trace their origins to the colonial era. I will base my research, or I will give more weight on Ras Gharib, because basically Ras Gharib was built from scratch in order to house the petroleum industry. There was no location, there was no city in that location, there was no human settlement in that location prior to the start of oil extraction works in 1938. The city used to be a focal point of a region, the Gulf of Suez region, that was responsible for roughly 2/3 of the country's oil, of Egypt's oil production, but now its share has dropped into around 1/4 of the Egyptian oil production. And Egypt is particularly important in this, is particularly important in this regard, because the Egyptian government has plans that by 2030, that Egypt would be turned into a global energy market, or an energy hub, owing to oil and natural gas discoveries in the Mediterranean and in the Western Desert. So the developments in Ras Gharib and the development of the city of Ras Gharib can pave the way for studying the potential impact of such policies in a country like Egypt that can be more or less representative of the oil city or oil-based developments in the global south. Next slide, please. We will compare these oil cities based on a matrix. This matrix I have developed in my master research at the Technical University of Berlin. It compares the cities based on parameters related to physical and social mobility, the impact of the oil industry on the service structures, the demographics and the industrial and urban governance, and current trends when it comes to responses to stimuli like COVID-19 and climate change and decarbonization. Next slide, please. The final part of the research will be will aim towards creating a sustainable scenario and a what next scenario. What happens when the dust of climate change policies settle down? What happens when the current realities are no longer applicable? If we cannot continue business as usual. So we have to come up with a solution for these cities in order not to leave them to their fate. And this will take the shape of policy and executive recommendations along the same lines presented in the comparison matrix that we have just mentioned, along the lines of mobility, service provision, demographics, industrial and urban governance, and sustainable economic diversification through the potential investment in renewables, decarbonization of the oil industry, and training and re-education of the oil industry labor, and inclusive and participatory development planning. Next slide, please. The hypotheses and research questions that will present themselves after through this body of work is that climate change is a global challenge, but the weight of or the burden of witnessing of fighting off this change or dealing with this change is not evenly distributed. Some economic sectors are more liable to adverse effects like the oil industry, and these adverse effects are more shortly differentiate along north-south divide. Next slide, please. Yes, and oil cities can be turned through climate change mitigation response policies and decarbonization into flagships for facing climate change, flagships for dealing with climate change through the presentation of opportunities for economic growth and opportunities for improvement along the lines of the matrix that I have discussed with you just now. Next slide, please. So the research questions will be, how are global stratification hierarchy reflected in oil cities and oil industry and so on? What are the possible effects of climate change and decarbonization on the oil industry, and particularly in oil cities? And how can oil cities in the global south respond to all these changes and challenges along the line of political, societal, or social, economic, and environmental conditions? Next slide, please. So to conclude, oil cities in the global south help to ramp up the oil industry globally, and hence help the economic development globally, and they were really important, but they really didn't share the benefits that their northern counterparts had. In order to correct this, we need to work along political, societal, social, economic, and environmental lines in order to try to deal with this industrial urban complex, especially in oil cities. The oil cities highlight the importance of democratization and the participation in industrial and urban governance, and hence it has to be enforced in order to enact the proper utilization of oil rents and other revenues in development. And finally, like what is evident in the case like the city of Hasarib, economies in oil cities must be diversified. Next.
Thank you, Ali. Joe, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Ali. That was an excellent presentation. I very much enjoyed hearing you elaborate your argument in such detail. As I indicated to Franklin earlier, I don't want to take up too much time articulating my own position about these very important issues. People didn't turn up here to listen to me speak. We want to hear what you had to say, and I'm merely here as a discussant to try and prompt you to consider various themes that certainly jumped off the page to me. And the first thing I would say is I'll take this opportunity to commend you for this wonderful research project that is full of such potential. The most exciting aspect that I can discern is that this is going to be an authentic contribution, and a much needed one, to the corpus of theory that Franklin and I both have attempted to contribute to, and that is, of course, the body of Southern theory. Southern theory is a term developed by somebody named Raewyn Connell, and indeed it refers to the fact that the majority of social scientific theorization about the experience of people in the global south has tended to be an imposition of theoretical perspectives that have been developed in the global north and have simply been seen as a harvesting exercise of data from the global south to plug into these theories that have been developed in the lived experience of people from the global north. And what you're trying to do is to work, as Franklin would call it, from the very granular level of the experience of an oil city in Egypt, and to try and understand on that basis what kind of theoretical, what type of conceptual and indeed analytical results we can obtain. So I think that process in itself is worthwhile, and indeed the contours of the project that you've outlined is very exciting to me, so as somebody that is engaged in the theorization of rent and of landed property. So that's the first thing, a sort of glowing endorsement of what it is that you're trying to do. My question, or my first question, I have several. My first question really is around this issue of methodology, and particularly in how it relates to the quite controversial problematic that you're working within. And I'm very sympathetic to the position that you've taken, and I'm a little bit anxious for you, to be honest, because it is such a tricky problem, and indeed you will attract many detractors because you're treading such a fine line between this question of what exactly you do with existing oil cities, and indeed with the goal of decarbonisation in mind. So I wondered if you could perhaps elaborate a little further on the inspiration for your methodological framework, because one of the things that struck me in listening to your paper today, and indeed having the pleasure of reading the written version, was that it wasn't clear to me how exactly you were going to navigate the quite treacherous and long historical legacy of the various foundations of thought that you're dealing with. And there's obviously a quite pragmatic and pluralist approach to political economy concerns that you're deploying. But to what extent can we deal with, say, the incommensurable ontological premises of some of the theoretical perspectives that you've deployed? For example, you make reference to a world systems analysis, and I think it's a useful point of departure to try and locate the oil city within this vertically and horizontally integrated of geopolitical structures that are broadly organized according to a core and indeed a periphery and everything in between. But you also make reference to a system of theory that you've referred to as combined and uneven development. And of course, as somebody writing within the context of Egypt, I think it's a necessary reference given the work of people like Samir Amin and Amin's wonderful body of work, beginning in all the way in 1955 as a 20-year-old participant in the Bandung Conference, which is, I suppose, one of those milestones in the attempt of the Global South to assert its sovereignty in negotiations with both the Soviet and the US imperia at the time. But this notion of combined and uneven development does not necessarily fit well within a tradition of world systems analysis. And I think debates between Robert Brenner and Emmanuel Wallerstein that have become quite famous in this body of scholarship attest to that. And certainly that same kind of problematic has now become a feature of quite important debates that have emerged around ecological concerns. And I'm thinking specifically of those debates between people like Jason W. Moore, who's definitely coming out of a world systems approach, and people like John Bellamy Foster, Ariel Saleh, who's coming from obviously an ecological feminist approach, and so on. So I wondered if you could talk more about, and I do appreciate that you're in the very early stages of developing your thinking around these issues. So I'm not in any way suggesting that you would have some coherent and defined methodological framework as yet. But I wonder if you could talk a little about the sources of inspiration that you've pulled together to develop this research proposal. And indeed, what are some of the obstacles that you found in navigating this huge and voluminous discourse? So that's really the first question. And it leads to my sort of overarching concern. And I suppose I will begin at the end and I'll try to end at the beginning when we get to the end of the dialogue. And that is, in my view, the major strength of your research project is simultaneously its major limitation. And that strength and limitation is its empirical focus, or its emphasis on attempting to explain what is, rather than speculating prematurely perhaps what ought to be or what can be. And certainly there is a role for that kind of optimistic speculation, and certainly it features in your analysis, particularly in relation to how exactly those revenues should be distributed in order to promote, what the World Bank, and I try not to use too many World Bank categories, but what the World Bank is referring to as inclusive growth. I think there's much more to be done to further clarify what exactly that means, and your work is definitely contributing to that. But I suppose my point there is that how then do we move from the kind of materialist and granular exposition of what the reality of this oil city toward incorporating some kind of considered body of theory that has emerged from the experience of others working within the Global South context? And obviously, we have one of those theorists in the digital room with us now. Franklin's done wonderful work on oil cities, as you've referenced, and indeed, Franklin is a wonderful resource in that respect. But I wonder if you could just speak to those questions, particularly in relation to your interlocutors or your inspirations for how you've developed this methodological framework in the first instance.
All right. Thanks a lot, Dr. Collins, for the remarks. When it comes to my inspiration, this research project, the current research project that I'm working on under the supervision of Dr. Obeng-Odoom and Dr. Onodera, stems back to my master degree research when I was doing a master degree at the Technical University of Berlin in urban development. I did my research on petroleum cities, particularly the boomtown syndrome. So the boomtown syndrome is basically when it comes to in relation to oil extraction and petroleum cities, is with the discovery of petroleum in a certain location. You have an influx of capital and labor investments and so on into these locations, and with the and then you have a number of scenarios. Either this influx of investments and labor is sustainable and diversifies into other industries and other economic activities, into form forward linkages and create a more diverse economic base, returning a larger number of the population and so on. Or and the situation has some sort of linear growth. The other situation is that there is not enough development potential in the location, and so after a given period of time, the situation in this oil city or resource city tend to plateau, and it does not, and it's some sort of, it turns into some sort of a stunted growth. The city is locked in a stunted growth phase. The third thing is that with the outflux of after the depletion of the resource, whether it's minerals or oil and so on, there comes a phase of outflight that the investments and labor start to leave, leaving behind them inflated prices and dilapidated service structures, causing the original population of the location to leave as well, and this situation, the entire location turns into a ghost town. This is very evident. This took place in the American West during the California gold rush. It's one of the most evident episodes of such events in modern history. This is about the inspiration. This led me to think now with what can we do. My initial attempt at coming up with this research proposal was, what can we do in order to rejuvenate stunted boom towns? What can we do to help? What can be done in order to help these boom towns that has moved into the bust phase? So you have the boom town and you have the boom bust cycle. So a city like Houston can be considered as an example of an oil city that turned that is in some sort of a perpetual boom phase. The rate of the boom or the rate of growth may vary across along its history, but it is nonetheless growing. But in a location like Ras Gharib, which I've visited a couple of times, despite the fact that in the earlier days, or up to perhaps the 1970s and early 80s, the city was responsible for the production of roughly 2/3 of the Egyptian oil production. The city is when you move in, you have that you figure out that the city does not provide its citizens with much of the amenities you expect to find in an oil city, despite the fact that these people living in the petroleum industry have access to high-paying jobs and so on, but the service structures are not adapted or have not adapted to this influx of capital, and does not incubate for the growth of economic activity. And this so that led me to figure out, or to come up with the question of what can we do about this? What can we do about making these cities go alive again? So when I started discussing these proposals with Professor with Dr. Obeng-Odoom, we came up with he came up with a suggestion of considering the impacts of decarbonization and the associated the political, social, economic, and environmental changes related to the impact of, for instance, climate change and on oil cities, and how does this play against the background of the global north and south divide? I'm currently in my current phase of the research. I'm trying to base my research. So this is about the inspiration and interest. So currently, I'm trying to the effort that I have done, and I hope it is evident in my presentation and in the paper that you have read. I'm trying to base these interests in the proper academic context in order to be able to build upon it and have a more constructive input in order to locate my research within the proper academic framework, within the proper academic discourse, within. So I'm currently still investigating where I should position my research, and for that I really value your input. Yes, and
it's my pleasure, and I will now that I have an idea of where you've come from in terms of your thinking. If you'll permit me, I'd like to help. I suppose give you some ideas in terms of what I think would be useful for you to consider in terms of developing your methodology further, and certainly in terms of clarifying the research questions. The first current, or the first emerging body of scholarship that came to mind when I read your project was something that's quite exciting for me, and it's called the Systems of Provision approach, and it's emerged out of the School of Oriental and African Studies based at the University of London. It's about 20 years old now. It was first pioneered by Ben Fine and Ellen Leopold in a wonderful book published in 1993 called The World of Consumption. And in that book, they put forward a novel theory of consumption that integrated consumption within the existing theories of production. And this was a rejection of the mainstream approaches that considered production and consumption analytically distinct. And I'll get to why I think this might be an important avenue for you to explore. I think the systems of provision approach throws the spotlight on a dirty secret of the critiques, or the ecological critiques of particular modes of consumption. And that dirty secret is that consumption does not just exist at the end user. Okay, end users ourselves, all of us, in order for us to subsist, we must go to marketplaces of various descriptions and consume things on the basis of usually the exchange of our labor time for a wage in order to live. But in order for us to consume things as end users, there has been an entire host of vertically integrated productive consumption that must transpire before that end point of exchange. And your commodity, or your object of analysis, oil, is one of these unique goods that filters through the vertically integrated production process in various ways. So the point that I'm trying to suggest here is, through an integrated view of consumption and production, it may allow you to explore some of the nuances that you've outlined, or the contradictions that you've outlined in terms of the twin goal of maintaining inclusive, not just growth, but sustainable development within oil cities, and indeed the overall goal of decarbonisation. The second body of scholarship that I'd point you to is one that I think is not just specific to your case study in terms of understanding the core and periphery relationships and combined and uneven development, but one that's very specific to the location of your object of analysis, being Egypt itself. And that's the work done by Samir Amin on the worldwide law of accumulation. Amin, of course, was part of a group that has been in hindsight called, I think, erroneously labelled, a group of dependency theorists. I think it's erroneous to call Amin a dependency theorist simply because these schools of thought, these labels, are imposed always in hindsight, and the people that contributed to this body of scholarship were not always in agreement, and I think the subtle nuances of their contending arguments need to be brought out, particularly when we're trying to apply them to current circumstances. And Amin's theorization of how exactly this core periphery relationship worked was developed over a lifetime of activism within the Global South to try and create modes of economic development that were not contingent upon the drive for capital to accumulate coming out of the core countries. And this leads me, I suppose, to a key concern of mine in relation to your project. And that is, while I'm deeply sympathetic to I suppose, the normative vision that you outlined towards the end of your paper, the ways in which the various revenue streams generated through currently existing structures of industry within oil cities can better be distributed to attend to, ameliorating some of the deleterious consequences of extractivism in these places. I wonder to what extent this, I suppose, not overlooks, but I suppose does not grapple concretely, as you have done with the rest of your analysis, the actually existing state apparatus within this place. I found this wonderful line in your paper where you said that in order for these kinds of socially just distributional measures to take place, it would require this kind of holistic overturning of currently existing institutional arrangements of governance institutions and so on. And that jumped off the page at me because I thought, well, yeah, you're right. I mean, of course it does. But what you're talking about is a huge, I mean, that's a hugely significant and radical claim where you're effectively saying that in order for these things to happen, this normative vision that you've outlined to happen, it's contingent upon a radical shift in the institutional arrangement of governance that dictates the distribution of oil revenues. And I found myself in furious agreement, but I also found myself, as I read on, quite concerned and I must admit, I'm deeply ignorant of Egyptian political economy, but I wonder to what extent this will require you to spend some time within the research plan articulating somewhat of an anatomy of power mediated through the state apparatus so that you can better understand what exactly needs to be changed for this vision to be realized.
Perhaps I should have made more reference to this in the presentation and probably in the paper that I have shared with Dr. Obeng-Odoom and you, is that one of the findings that I had in my master's thesis is that Egypt is a very sharp example of the core periphery divide, where we have a central, both in the geographical and in the administrative, a central entity, both in the geographical and the administrative spheres, controlling the rest of the country, when the resources and so on. And this core periphery divide is projected in some sort of domestic colonialism. So it's as if that the post-colonial state in Egypt, as well as in other parts of the global south, have inherited this colonial structure, and it's still using it in full force to this day in order to accumulate wealth and power for a certain group, on the expense of the general population, especially on the expense of the population of these colonial outposts. This is very evident in the case of Ras Gharib, for instance, as a petroleum city, where the locals, and by locals I mean people who have spent more time or are descendants of those who came here first, look towards the government officials and other people from outside the city coming to work in the petroleum industry. They tend to view them as more in a very they view them as colonial agents. They are those who come to collect revenues from the city and leave. So yes, in order to referring back to the line that you have mentioned in the paper that you've read, yes, in order to enact evenly distributed development efforts, this domestic colonial structure needs to be overhauled, because it is the role of the state to manage development, not to distribute the revenues of development according to not to distribute or even to commandeer the revenues of development. So they are there to make sure that the revenues of development are evenly distributed, and this is not the case. And the city of Ras Gharib is a very prominent example of this situation, because it shows that this domestic colonial model still exists in full force, and it needs to be dismantled.
Yep. Thank you. And I'm wary that we're running out of time, so I might just offer one final comment, if you don't mind. And that is that, and again, another reference for you to consider that speaks to this conundrum. And that was mentioned by Franklin in the opening introduction. So the work of Professor Chibuzzo Nwoki, working in Nigeria, I believe, at the moment, who looked at various nationalizations of oil industries in the 1980s, when one of the emerging areas of scholarship at the time was the rise of the Global South through something called the New International Economic Order. And the idea being that with the restructuring of the International Division of Labour, the poorest countries who controlled the majority of the world's raw materials would therefore be able to assert their control over those materials and therefore reap the rewards of the exchange of those materials to countries in the industrial core. And Nwoki demonstrated that this is in fact not going to transpire, and indeed for very important reasons. And one of the key reasons was that even with the nationalization of an oil industry, the capacity to generate and retain the profits and the rents within the country are mitigated by the reliance upon foreign capital for the initial investment and indeed for foreign capital goods. So while, and this speaks to Min's work on unequal exchange, as the reserves themselves become more difficult to tap into, they become further offshore, deeper in the ocean and so on and so on. And the scale of production becomes such that huge capital infrastructure is required at the outset with not much return for several years. This means that there needs to be a reliance, particularly with countries with shallow domestic savings bases, there needs to be a reliance on foreign capital and indeed the kind of intellectual property that through organizations like the World Trade Organization are being concentrated in the ownership of the global north. It's the reliance upon this capital and capital goods that misappropriates the revenues that are generated through the oil industry. So that's one comment. And my final comment would be that I really commend your attempt to try and throw open this very sticky contradiction of oil cities. And I would just add, as my parting comment, that while oil is bound up in its own contradictions, so is the energy production that we're moving towards, which is, of course, a decarbonised strategy and indeed a reliance upon clean energy. That mode of energy production is also rife with contradictions so long as we remain within the current mode of social organisation, right? So a mode of social organisation driven by a reliance on production mediated by concentrated capital in transnational corporations, dealing with states and governance institutions like you've outlined, who do not have the capacity to appropriate the gains from this type of production, will always be riven with internal contradictions. And clean energy is just another example. And my question, I suppose, to reflect upon going into the general discussion is what exactly happens when oil cities turn into rare earth mineral cities once we've achieved the decarbonisation strategy? We can refer to the experience of places in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, where cadmium, selenium and cobalt are being mined in atrocious working conditions and exported to fuel the demand for rare earth minerals that go into the production of renewable energy devices. So, and I'm not in any way suggesting that we should halt the movement toward renewable energy, but I'm just suggesting that under current systems of organising production, even that is riven with contradiction. And I'll end with one final quote from another Southern theorist, in the spirit of Franklin's wonderful introductory comments. And that quote, of course, is from Patrice Lumumba, that political independence has no meaning if it is not accompanied by rapid economic and social development. And of course, we all know what happened to Lumumba. And I end with this quote because I'm attempting to commend you on taking up these very important and these very politically loaded and these very dangerous questions. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I have one last remark on the last question. That there's another. We have to also to contextualize this question within the urban level. So. When the government moved in and nationalized international international companies working, or international oil private companies working in the petroleum industry, and integrated into public sector companies like here in Egypt, for instance, they more or less siphoned the potential revenues generated within these local economies and distributed it on the national economy, on the national scale. So the share of the local economies in the profits of this extractive industry has actually become less. And this is very evident in the situation of Ras Gharib, and this is something that I wanted to point out in order to add your significant concluding remarks. Thank you.
that Joe mentioned Patrice Lumumba. As you can see, Patrice Lumumba is looking on us from the picture behind me. So it's a good reminder that the struggle must continue. Thank you very much, Ali and Joe, for a stimulating dialogue. Now that you have had your much anticipated dialogue, not quite like Joe and Donald, but still much anticipated, the floor is now open for everyone to make comments or ask questions by placing these in the chat box.
Thus far, our participants have been a little shy with the chat box. So Franklin, if there are some questions that you maybe want to ask of either our presenter or our discussant, I encourage you to take the floor, don't be shy.
Thank you very much indeed. Henry would like to make some observations. So Henry, you now can ask your questions or make your comments.
Hi, and thank you very much, Ali, for very interesting and fascinating, presenting a very fascinating case and research plan for the future. I'd rather reserve space for you, the experts, on the theme to discuss more deeply your research, especially Joe Collins. We have the opportunity to hear you today. One thing, many issues actually were already discussed that I had in mind. One was the quite clear kind of dynamic between, as Joe pointed out, the dynamic between the normative vision in order to find solutions and in order to find recommendations and what to do with all cities generally, but also Ras Gharib in Egypt in particular. While on the other hand, there is the more scientific knowledge interest to try to find ways to understand these processes better and perhaps locate some areas that raise out, that come out from your case study that would be of theoretical or scientific interest elsewhere in the Global South. And I really commend you as well for taking up this task to in your research. I'm personally quite empirically oriented, and this is also one question or issue that was raised by Joe, is that I think in order to understand better the normative visions of what to do and what is there to be done and what Joe termed the anatomy of power, for instance, in the case of Ras Gharib, I think it would be very, very important to provide for the reader. I had an opportunity to read the earlier draft of this text, to provide more kind of empirical and detailed presentation of what is going on in Ras Gharib as much as possible in terms of its importance or place in the national economy or politics even. It is, as far as I understand, it is a kind of state-led economic venture, but also in the paper you present or you mention transnational cooperation. So this kind of, for instance, it would be interesting to know more and important to know more about how this public sector and private or transnational companies kind of intersect in this whole city of Ras Gharib. So the point is that for us to be even more fascinated by the case study, I think it would be important to know more about it. in the future presentation or paper. I think you are the expert in this field, and for those who are not familiar with Egypt, it would be important to have the kind of empirical situation analysis of what is going on there. But this is perhaps one of the questions I'd like to raise. Could you tell us more about how the kind of public and private economic sectors coexist in Ras Gharib, but also we can talk about formal and informal economies if you like.
Yes, of course. To answer this question, I will give you I'll try to give a very brief background on how the oil sector came to be in Ras Gharib. So Ras Gharib was primarily developed by the now nationalized Anglo-Egyptian Oilfield Company, which was a joint venture between British Petroleum and Royal Dutch Shell that was established in London in 1909. The company started operating in further down the coast from Ras Gharib, in other locations along the Red Sea coast of Egypt, around the onset of the First World War. And of course, the production was interrupted during the war, and after the war, production recommenced. And at that time, there was no settlements with considerable body of population around on this coast, as most of the Egyptian population are located in Nile Valley and Delta. So, for instance, petroleum extraction operations started in Ras Gharib by the Anglo-Egyptian Oilfield Company in 1938. And the company was fully responsible for the provision for the lives and livelihoods of the workers in the city. The city had no source of open water, so water was shipped from Suez, which lies around 200 or 230 kilometers to the north, and as there is no local population, so for casual jobs in the petroleum sector, workers were moved in from other areas of Egypt, particularly in Upper Egypt. Yes, and for instance, Ras Gharib first appeared on the census of Egyptian population in 1947. At that time, it had a population of around slightly less than 4,000 inhabitants. After the 1952 revolution and the toppling of the monarchy in Egypt, the oil industry, the oil sector was still affiliated to the global market with international companies like SoCal and the Royal Dutch Shell still operating in the region. The companies were the company, basically the Anglo-Egyptian, the oil fields, were responsible for running the Ras Gharib site, which was at that time still some sort of a labor camp. So, the company was nationalized in the 1960s and turned into the General Petroleum Company, which is a public sector company in Egypt. And the city council was established. The city was incorporated in 1962. Still, despite the establishment of the city council, the petroleum company, the GPC, the General Petroleum Company, was responsible for the provision of all services, including housing for the labor force, to the extent that with the stabilization of the situation in Ras Gharib and the establishment of the municipality, workers from all classes started bringing in their families, and the settlement moved in from being a labor camp into being a town and later a city. So the General Petroleum Company started setting up schools, infirmaries, hospitals, and other forms of social and economic services. And almost everybody was working in the petroleum sector in the company, in the city. Fast track to the 1980s. The Egyptian government, under pressure from the World Bank, started investigating the possibilities of liberalizing the Egyptian economy and shedding off some of the burdens taken on by the public sector companies, like housing and service provision. So around that time, the general petroleum company stopped providing housing units and shifted back to the labor camp system, where workers would come in rotations almost 2 weeks in order to work and then leave, and this helped isolate the city from the national context further, and isolate the population and with the absence of economic diversification in the local economy, all the or most of the people of the residents living in the city had their livelihoods tied to the petroleum sector, to the extent that regardless of how much the management of the General Petroleum Company, which is the largest employer to this date in the city, tries to project to the local population that they have no adequate number of job openings to take in the new entries into the job market. People would insist on working in the petroleum sector nonetheless. Starting with the 1990s as well, the petroleum market in Egypt started opening up again to private Egyptian private sector and international investment. So this created a space for the creation of more jobs, not by the government or not by the public sector, but the private sector, be it national or international. But still, this did not really diversify the economy as much as it did. It had an impact on creating more jobs in the same sector, which in turn reinforced the image of the city as an oil city and nothing else. So people who do not have the skills or the knowledge to work in the petroleum sector, they usually find themselves compelled to find work elsewhere. Even high-skilled professionals like architects, engineers, and so on. Even physicians, and then yes. So coming back to the question of the relationship between the public and private business sectors and the implication of these relations in the oil city and Ras Gharib in particular. So Ras Gharib is still dominated by the largest employer, General Petroleum Company, with small shares in the market for private companies, and of course international companies exist, but still particularly international companies, they tend not to invest in serving their workforce in the city, and they provide their services for them elsewhere. And the city, since that the company the General Petroleum Company led the way of reverting back to the labor camp situation, all companies that follow suit. So the city is is hinging on this fact. Okay.
Thank you very much. It's I think it's important to hear more and also to research more about this, as was pointed out earlier. What is there now, or the question of what is going on in Ras Gharib, and especially for for us who are hearing about your very interesting and very important research to know these kind of details also in order to discuss better with also with the normative visions or with the kind of normative aspirations in the study. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Ali, I have two questions that that might constitute a bridge between Joe's theoretical concerns and Henry's more empirical concerns. The first is that you begin your presentation with a list of urban problems, and the standard question for urbanists is, are these problems of cities or problems in cities? Particularly, to unpack this, I'm interested to know whether these problems are general to cities in Egypt, or they are specific to oil cities. In other words, what has oil got to do with the problems you listed?
The thing is, in Egypt, we don't have that much of oil cities. Ras Gharib can safely be considered as the oil city of Egypt. So within the Egyptian context, these questions or these problems are problems of the oil city and in the oil city. So that's within the Egyptian context. Further research needs to be done in order to generalize these questions. But I think, referring back to my previous research and current ongoing research, is that when it comes to oil cities, they tend to share in most of these problems. So, so these questions can be generalized as these problems can be generalized as problems within questions problems of oil cities, but with particularly those who share the similar conditions for Ras Gharib, where the economy is not very diversified and is more dependent on singular economic activity that is in turn liable to changes by or to aggressive adaptations by climate change adaptation and mitigation policies, like which is the oil industry, of course.
Okay, so perhaps along the way, some more data to show these differences could be very helpful. The second question is, what do you think is the scientific contribution or the scholarly contribution of your proposed work? The empirical contribution is quite obvious, but the scholarly contribution or the scientific contribution.
Well, I think the main scientific or scholarly contribution is that may come out of my work is helping in establishing a scientific base for development in the global south, particularly particularly those depending on resource development. So those with resource-based development. So we have this situation of resource-based development, which is still ongoing in many parts of the global south, but with particularly depending on energy resources. So the main, what I envisage will be the main contribution of my work to this is to answer in a proper academic and scientific way what to do with these cities, with these urban economies, based on their own conditions and not based on imported body of scientific knowledge imported from the global from the global north. Because basically we in the global south have to deal with different conditions like colonialism, the prevalence of some of the colonial structures even in the post-colonial states. So we have a lot to dismantle before we can go ahead and deal with these problems on our own terms. So what I see is my main contribution is to lay the foundation, the academic foundation of doing this stuff.
Thank you. In the absence of any further questions and the light of the fact that we are getting closer and closer to the end, I'd like to say that it has been a real delight to see the nature of this session. Clearly, we need more of such sessions, so others will follow. I am now putting in the chat box. I've just put a link to the schedule for the rest of the symposium in the chat box. I'd like to clarify that even if you did not register for the specific event, you are welcome to attend those sessions. In the meanwhile, I'd like to make 3 points. First, to express the gratitude of both the presenter and the organizers to Dr. Joe Collins for his constructive feedback, or to use his words, and I quote, sympathetic critique. Joe received the paper rather late, so I'm personally thankful for demonstrating his usual generosity of spirit, which is always showered on me, both in Australia and now in Finland. I can only be grateful that he's a living testament, a living proof of the spirit of the Bandung Conference in pursuing Asian African alliance, indeed, an alliance of the entire global South. Second, please join me in thanking my colleagues, Sophia, Sana, and Oslem for helping to make this symposium, or this session of the symposium, a great success. And third, please let's thank Ali Almoghazy for an excellent proposed study, for presenting a proposed study in a compelling way, for his brilliant presentation. And as I normally say, for exemplary cool-headedness in addressing Albany and also easy questions, and more fundamentally for coming all the way from Egypt, albeit virtually, to do us this honor. So thank you very much.
Thank you all, and thank you all for being here to listen to what I have to say, and hopefully we should meet either soon, in virtually or in person.
Okay, thank you.
And thanks very much for having me along. It was an excellent session to be a part of, and I hope you'll keep me in mind for any future events, because I'd be very happy to participate. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Sophia, do you want to say something, or is it?
Yes, I was going to say, before everybody exits the room, I'm going to launch a very quick small feedback poll. After the symposium, we'll have one that allows for exposition, but this is just a very short one. It's anonymous. Only I and the organizers are going to see it. So please feel free to answer honestly. And everybody can keep talking over the poll.
I just respond to one of the questions put in the chat about the capacity for post-oil energy transitions to facilitate decolonization, and if there are proactive political agendas around for this. And there certainly are, and I'd encourage people to seek them out. I'd refer to the Third World Development Forum as one particular initiative that is bound up in the history of the Bandung movement and the non-aligned movement. And it has a very close relationship with the people of Egypt. Indeed, Samira Amin, who championed that cause, who died only a couple of years ago, lived a long and I suppose energetic life fighting for those particular causes. And the truth of the matter is that 4/5 of the world's population inhabits the low and middle income countries. And if we're going to seek a solution to what are truly global problems, then we need to be able to mobilize that critical mass of sensuous human activity. So this is why this space is so important and so exciting.
Thank you very much, Joe. I think I cannot see any other questions. So on that note, if Sophia doesn't have any more announcements, then it's been wonderful having this discussion. Thank you very much, everybody. Thanks a lot.
Thank you all.
Thank you all for coming. I'm going to end the meeting.